All right, we are recording. We will start at 8 o'clock. I won't take attendance since this is 100% online. We'll just do what we usually do, send in the attendance words, and that'll be that. I don't think I have any announcements or reminders. I guess my biggest reminder is don't forget to get some independent work done. Some of you haven't even started yet. Um, and I know what it's like. When I was a student, I used to do what I called forced procrastination, which is where I had other things that were due. So I always put off the things that were due later, because I had to. But you guys want to definitely get started on that. Get working. Okay. Excuse me. It's 8 o'clock. Let's get started. This actually works out that we're doing this today because I'm actually getting a little bit sick. So had I not planned on teaching from home today, I probably would have anyway. But anyway, does anybody have any questions before we get started? All right, then let's get started. We're going to talk about the evidence of evolution. We excuse me. Oh yeah, sorry. The first word for attendance will be Veterans Day, since today is Veterans Day. But let's dive into the evidence of evolution. Evolution leaves observable signs. Biological evolution has left evidence in fossils and today's organisms. And we're going to talk about both of these things. If you download the PowerPoint, you can click that. And it should be a little short video that talks about some of the evidence. Same here. If you download the PowerPoint and click this sign, it'll give you a little short video that talks about what we are about to talk about. Does anybody have any questions so far? All right, let's talk about evidence from fossils. What was that last week? I don't remember which day last week, but sometime last week you were officially um, introduced to the term fossils. So you know what a fossil is already, and you probably did before I taught you that. But fossils document differences between past and present organisms, like we talked about earlier when we talked about what Darwin, his observations, right? So we talked a lot about how he would look at fossils of animals that had clearly gone extinct, but they were still similar yet different from the animals that were alive in South America. So again, not only does it show the differences, but it also shows the similarities. And like this bullet point shows right here, it has proven that some species have gone extinct. And again, you know that's probably not new to you, but relatively speaking, that is new information, right? So there was a time when people didn't think animals went extinct, right? So bring back from the beginning of this chapter, there was a time when people thought this is the way it is, this is the way it always has been, and this is the way it always will be, right? But we now know that's not the case. So fossils aren't perfect though, and I'm going to dive into that a little bit more deeper later. But for now, obviously, the soft parts of organisms decay too rapidly, so those parts don't get fossilized, generally speaking. And generally speaking, it's only the hard parts that are rich in minerals that remain as fossils, right? So that's why we see, the dinosaur skeletons, for example. Anyways, anybody have any questions about this slide? So again, I think when most people think of fossils, they usually think of, like the bones, like you'll see, dinosaur skeletons in a museum, but not all fossils are bones, much less remnants, right? Some of them might be casts, which is when a buried organism decomposes and leaves an empty mold filled by minerals that were dissolved in water. Sometimes fossils can be imprints, such as footprints or burrows or remains of organisms after they've decayed. And then there's also basically fossilized poop, coprolites. Um, so yes, again, and this is probably, as far as the exam is concerned, this is probably the first important slide because I might ask you questions about this to differentiate between the different types of fossils. If you download this PowerPoint, you can click this picture here. This is a picture of a coprolite, and it's funny. The video is somebody working like a museum worker, and they're walking around with a coprolite, and hey, it's a fossil, and they're passing it around and showing it to people, and the people are holding it like, oh, that's cool, it's a fossil. But then the person tells them it's a coprolite, and some of the people who were holding the fossilized poop got a little bit grossed out about it. But anyway, you can download that and watch it if you want. But also, this brings us to another word that you need to. I might ask you about this. I'm not sure, but paleontologists. Paleontologists are scientists who study fossils, and you probably already knew that too. But there you go. Any questions so far? All right. Rarely, an entire organism, including the soft parts, can get encased in a medium that prevents decomposition, which is not necessarily the same as a fossil, but it's kind of categorized the same. Some good examples are insects in amber. I don't know if you guys have seen the first Jurassic Park, but it was based on this. There was a mosquito that had, gotten a meal from dinosaur blood, then landed on a tree, which got covered in tree resin or sap. Is another way of putting that. Man, sorry about that. I don't know what's up with those lines. Anyway, it got covered with the sap, and then that sap fossilized, and that gives us amber, right? So then there was that mosquito, perfectly preserved in that amber. Anyway, some other examples are mammoths, bison, and even prehistoric humans that have been frozen in ice or preserved in bogs. And both of these are good independent work topics. So I didn't really get that specific. So maybe just for 1 point, go out there and find me an example, right? So look up a story where somebody found insects in amber, send it to me in an email. You don't even need to write a paper about it. Just say, hey, you said this was a good independent work topic. So I looked it up, and here's one. Here's an example. Of course, you could write a paper about it if you want and do a Google Doc and kind of summarize it in your own words, but make sure you summarize in your own words and you're not using AI and you're not rewording it. You're actually using your words to summarize it. Anyway, yeah, that's a good idea for independent work. Any questions about this slide? Oh yeah, obviously too. If you download this PowerPoint, you can click on that where it says prehistoric humans, and it'll show a little video of that. This picture is not from, it's not an actual example. That'll be the next independent work. Not excuse me, not independent work. The next attendance word. So your next word or phrase, just describe this picture. If you know what movie it's from, that just tell me the movie. Otherwise, just use your own words to describe what this picture is. Any questions? All right. So here's some examples, and this is pictures from your old book. So here we see a 45 million year old insect, right, and that's embedded in the amber. Here's what we have. I think most people think of as fossils. So you can see this person's excavating, he's digging it out. Here we have another good example. So what do you call that? Petrified wood is another good example. And then here we have some footprints left by a dinosaur 120 million years ago. And then at the bottom right, we have the tusks of a 23,000-year-old mammoth that was discovered in Siberian ice. As a matter of fact, and then once again, another independent work topic, if I remember correctly, somebody was talking about kind of doing a Jurassic Park thing, but not with dinosaurs, but doing it with a mammoth, because there was enough of it preserved and preserved well enough where they could get the DNA. And I think they were talking about trying to bring back an extinct species. So again, another good independent work topic if you want to look into it. Any questions about this slide? All right. So let's talk about the fossil record. The fossil record is a sequence of fossils as they appear in rock layers, marking the passage of geological time. Because younger strata are on top of older, relative ages can be determined. So I don't know if you guys recognize this picture. Um, Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I think I took this picture, but I don't remember for sure. But if I remember correctly, this is off of I-64. So even if you don't recognize this exact spot, you've probably seen something like this. And yes, this area up here, this is the newer stuff, right? Because this, I don't want to say on top, because when we think about on top, we think up here, right? On top, on bottom. But because of the forces of the earth, things have shifted, right? And you can see though, this used to be on top, and over here on the right used to be on the bottom. So this is older stuff. So even without like carbon dating or anything like that, scientists can tell the relative ages of something. Like, for example, if somebody found a fossil right here in spot A, and then also found a fossil right here in spot B, and then also found a fossil right here in spot C, we can tell that whatever organism was in spot A was much older than the organisms in B, which was older than the organisms in C, right? Without even having to do any kind of chemistry, chemical dating or radiological dating, we can tell which one is older. So again, this is good evidence of evolution because we can see the progression of organisms through time, even if we don't know the exact date, which a lot of now we do. But even forget about all that, you can tell by the sequence of where they were found, what is older than what. Excuse me. Any questions about that? All right, pretty simple. Keep moving. As Darwin acknowledged, the fossil record is incomplete. This is an important thing to keep in mind because it is not perfect. Many organisms didn't live in areas that favor fossilization. So, fossilization, actually, before I even get into this, really, when you think about it, fossilization is quite rare. It's the exception, not the rule, for all these reasons that I have listed here. Like I said, some of them didn't live in areas that favor fossilization. Many fossils were in rocks that have been later distorted or destroyed by geological processes. And the example I always give for that, actually, you know what? I'll give a different example now. The Appalachian, the mountains, right? The Appalachian Mountains. Those came to be because um, Europe and Africa crashed into North and South America, and they were crashing into each other, and that's where those mountains, our mountains, came from. And they actually used to be bigger, taller than like Mount Everest, right? So they were huge. But you have to imagine that much force with four continents crashing into each other. If there was fossils there, they were probably destroyed. Not to mention, like I said, our mountains used to be taller than the Himalayas, right? Taller than Mount Everest. So obviously a lot has happened to them to wear them down to where they are today. And if there were any fossils in those rocks, obviously they've probably been destroyed for obvious reasons. And then, of course, the final one is that not all fossils are accessible to paleontologists, right? So not only was fossilization relatively rare, but that we also can't even get to all the fossils. So yeah, the fossil record is incomplete. It is not perfect. Does anybody have any questions about this slide? All right. Darwin predicted the existence of fossils of transitional forms linking very different groups of organisms. And transitional fossils show a combination of traits that include, like, again, they call them sometimes the missing link. In the book example, the old textbook example, not the one you guys have, is this Archaeopteryx right here. It has a combination of reptilian and bird-like features, right? So we know now that birds came from dinosaurs, basically. But this was one of the fossils that helped make that link. And if you download the PowerPoint, no, never mind. I thought that may have been a link to a video, but it's not. Anyway, that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you about it. But again, transitional fossils is a big part of the fossil record. Yeah. So any questions about that? All right. We're going to skip this. Again, this is from the old textbook. They had every chapter had something called the process of science, which I love. And this is why I included it. And you try to keep it in all the PowerPoints. So you can read this if you want. But it really shows, it's a great example of evolution and how, and taxonomy and how we classify all these different whales. But yeah, I'm not going to go through this because I'm not going to test you on it. But I will quickly mention, actually, we'll come back to this. This will be important later. You can see all these different bones. And again, that we'll come back to that. Speaking of which, yeah, we're going to come back to that right now from the evidence of homology. So we talked about fossils. We're done with that. Now we're going to talk about homologies, which is what I just basically skipped over. So let's take a look. So you definitely need to know what a homology is, and these are similarities that result from a common ancestor, right? So a homology is like a physical similarity as a result of having a common ancestor. So, for example, all mammals and reptiles and birds, well, with the exception of snakes, so not all reptiles, but for the most part, we're all what you call tetrapods, right? So all mammals and birds and reptiles and even amphibians were called tetrapods because we have a common ancestor that had 4 limbs. And not all animals have 4 limbs, right? Some animals don't have any limbs. Like coral, for example. Some animals have more than 4 limbs, like starfish, for example, right? So that is one example of a homology. Not that you need to know that example, but yes, that's what a homology is. So characteristics in an ancestral organism altered over time as descendants face different environmental conditions. So again, all of us tetrapods, we all have 4 limbs, but throughout the millions and billions of years of these species going into different areas and having different environmental conditions, they adapted to their conditions, right? So this is why we have so many different species now. So related species could have characteristics that have underlying similarity yet different functions. And I think a great example of that, and I think it's probably on one of the next slides I'm going to show you, but bats are a great example, right? We use our arms to grab stuff and move stuff, right? And bats use their arms as wings, right? So that's just a great example. So once again, it's a related species. A bat is a mammal just like us. So they have characteristics that have underlying similarities, like this. We have the same bones, different shape, but basically the same bones in our arms as bats do. But obviously, we have a completely different function. What we do with our arms, or what you would call 4 limbs, technically, is a lot different than what a bat would do with their 4 limbs. Any questions about this slide? All right. Actually, does anybody mind just letting me know that you can hear me? I know you guys are being really quiet, which is okay, but I just want to confirm that my mic is working.
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Thank you very much. All right. Darwin cited similarities amongst vertebrate 4 limbs as evidence of common ancestry. Same thing I was just talking about, right? So again, 4 limbs would be arms, 4 legs, flippers, wings, depending on the kind of mammal you're talking about. So we all have them. Well, not we all, but all tetrapods have them, right? And they're all similar but different because we have a common ancestor that was millions, probably billions of years ago. And as that species went and moved out geographically and went to different environmental conditions, then natural selection did its thing, and now we have all these different kinds of 4 limbs. And this is a good example that's not from your bird, right? Or not bird. This is a good example that's not from your book. But if you download the PowerPoint and click this, it should show you a video. But anyway, take a look at it if you want. And of course, this is just an example. I'm not going to ask you to memorize the fact that arms and 4 legs and flippers and wings are all called 4 limbs, right? Just an example. And this is a picture from the old textbook, and it really is a good example. So you can see we have the same bones as these other mammals, even whales who, they just use theirs as flippers, bats who use theirs as wings, right? We use ours, again, our 4 limbs to move and maneuver things. And cats use them to, well, they also do that too, but also mostly for locomotion, right? They walk on their 4 limbs. So just another great example of homology. And again, if you remember anything, that's what you need to memorize, is that we're talking about homologies right now. Similarities due to having a common ancestor is their homologies. So anatomical similarities in different organisms are called homologous structures. So yes, like I just said, like I'm trying to remind you, we're talking about homologies, but under that term homologies, we have subcategories. So far, what we've been talking about, even though those are homologies, we also consider them homologous structures. So we're specifically talking about anatomical similarities. And as you can probably guess, based on this, there are other similarities that we're going to talk about later, some other types of homologies. But right now, so far, everything we've talked about are homologous structures. And once again, this picture is just an example, and a really great example, right? So once again, the 4 limb of a bat is meant for wings. And I like that they use penguins, right? Because technically those are wings, but penguins don't fly, right? So even though those are wings, because those are birds, the function of their wings is actually serves more like a flipper, right? Helps them swim. Anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. Advances in molecular biology provide a much deeper understanding of homology. So, like I said, everything we just talked about previously, those are called homologous structures. And now we're kind of moving forward and talking about other homologies. The evolutionary history of each species is actually documented in our DNA, right? So the DNA that has been inherited from our ancestral species. In other words, you know how we can do 23andMe, for example, and you send in your DNA and they're like, oh yeah, you're related to this person in this way, because they're looking at the similarities and the differences in our DNA to figure out how you're related to people. And basically the same thing happens with organisms. So we can look at the DNA of organisms and figure out how they are related. Like when is their most recent common ancestor, things like that. And basically, as you can read here, the way it works is the closer the DNA is to matching, the more closely we are related. And the farther away, the more differences there are, the less related we are. And that's another great independent work topic. Pick anything and see how closely related we are to that thing. Like, for example, we share, man, I don't know the number. And again, could be a 1 point question for independent work. Like I think we have about 60% of our DNA is the same as a banana, for example. I'm not sure if that number is correct, but we have similarities. So that's another great independent work topic. And again, you could just send an email where you say something like, hey, I looked it up, and according to this source, our DNA is 98% the same as a chimpanzee, right? And that's 1 point. Or if you want to, you can open up Google Docs, write a paper about it, and summarize it. It's up to you. Anyway, just another good independent work topic if you want to do it. Any questions about this slide? Before I move forward, I'll give you an example that I've actually given you before. I don't remember the context or which chapter we were talking about when I talked about this. But humans and other primates are the only mammals that cannot make our own vitamin C. Like, we have to eat vitamin C because we can't produce it. However, humans and all the primates have the gene to do that. It's just that our gene is broken. So to me, that's such a great evidence of evolution, because not only does it show that we have a common ancestor, but it shows this is how evolution works, right? So just because the gene stops working because of a mutation, there is no mechanism to delete it, right? So because of that, we just have this useless gene. So the gene being there doesn't hurt anything, right? There is no disadvantage to having that broken gene. Therefore, there's no way for it to get naturally selected out, so to speak, right? So such a great example of evidence of evolution. Also, like I'll just leave it at that. Anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. So molecular biology provides strong evidence that all life forms are related. And here's some of that evidence. I might ask you about these bullet points. All life forms, all living organisms use the same genetic language of DNA and RNA, right? Even viruses, which aren't even alive, also use nucleic acids, and it's either DNA and or RNA, right? Same version, same stuff that we use. The genetic code is essentially universal. We've talked about that before. Like the example I gave was the fact that we use bacteria to make insulin, right? So we took a human gene that says this is how you produce insulin. We inserted it into the genome of bacteria, and the bacteria just produces that human protein for us. Yeah. And organisms as dissimilar as humans and bacteria share homologous genes inherited from a very distant common ancestor. Another good independent work topic. So like I said already, one topic is you could just loosely, or not loosely, but just look up the very easy question of how much similarities are there between a human and blah, 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 right? Whatever you want to look into. But then also, if you wanted to, you could get even more, you could look a little deeper into it. Instead of just saying like what percentage of our DNA is the same, then you could get even more specific and say which specific genes do we have that also bacteria have, which genes do we have that also, I don't know, uh, dolphins have, right? Whatever animal or organism you can think of, you could look that up. Any questions on this slide? All right. Geneticists have uncovered the hidden molecular homologies. Um, so organisms may retain genes that have lost function through mutations, even though homologous genes and related species are fully functional. We've already talked about this. So oh yeah, right here, right? This is the example I've already talked about. So we've already basically talked about this slide. The gene to make vitamin C, right? All mammals have it. Well, most mammals have it. Primates also have the gene, but our gene is broken. Therefore, we can't make vitamin C, right? But the gene is still there. Once again, great evidence of evolution. So, any questions about this slide? All right. The next word for attendance will be primate. But, and pay attention here, don't send the word primate, send an example of a primate, right? So, if you have to, look it up, but just think of a primate and send an example. And I'll give you one example that you can't use because I'm about to use it. But for example, chimpanzees are a primate, right? So you could have written chimpanzees. But again, come up with um, your own example of a primate. So if there's no questions, let's move forward. Um, so we've talked about homologous structures. We've talked about molecular homologies, right? Talking about the genes and the genome. Now we're moving on to something called vestigial structures. These are remnants of features that served important functions in an organism's ancestors, right? So, in other words, it's like when an organism has a feature, a structure, something anatomical that used to serve a purpose, but it no longer does. Some book examples are small pelvis and hind leg bones of ancient whales. So, as far as I know, whales now don't have any hind legs, but again, looking at the fossil record, whales used to, right? Whales used to have hind leg bones because they came from a land dwelling animal, right? An animal that walked on four legs on the land, eventually made its way back into the water. And that's where whales came from. So, yes, those hind legs used to serve a purpose of walking. But again, eventually they kind of went away. But there was that transition where there was some ancient whales that actually still had them. Some other examples are eye remnants and blind species of cavefish. And again, these are just examples. So once again, independent work topics, right? You can look those up and get specific with me. Tell me you looked it up and tell me exactly what species it is, all that stuff. But yeah, so there's a lot of blind species of, like, they don't need their eyes. Their eyes are useless, but there's still remnants of where their eyes were because, again, previously in a ancestral species of theirs, their ancestors, those eyes actually served a purpose. And here's a good example for humans: goosebumps. And that's interesting because it's not necessarily a structure, right? It's more like what our body does. But yeah, that's a good example. And if does anybody know why our ancestors would need goosebumps? Like, what is the use of having your hair stand up? Does anybody know? It's useless now, but it used to serve a purpose. If someone knows, that's okay. So, well, let me ask you this, and surely someone knows this, is to see who's brave enough to give us the answer, because I know you guys like to be quiet. But what causes goosebumps now? Like when you get goosebumps, what is the cause of that? And there's another word for it, and that kind of gives it away. That's why I'm not using the other word, because it would give it away. But why? What makes you get goosebumps? For an extra point of extra credit. If someone
The
wants to tell
cold.
me, yes, thank you. Cold, right? AKA chill bumps, because we used to be hairier. And what would happen is when your hair stands up like this, when you're hairy, what that does is it provides an insulation, right? So you've got the hair, and then you have like a layer of air, and then you have the skin, right? So it actually served a purpose to help keep us warm. And of course, it doesn't anymore. Um, and whoever said that, remind me when you send in your attendance words that you guessed correctly. And I hear somebody may have been uh, saying something. Excuse me. Let's see what this was. Sorry, I heard a noise. I want to make sure. Someone's not. Oh, well, okay. Never mind. Thought somebody had something to say. Oh, yeah, you raised a hand. That must have been you who said something. Sorry about the distraction, everybody. But yeah, Wilder, if that was you or whoever it was, just let me know, so you can get your extra points. Slide. There we go. Anyway, another good independent work topic is humans are so we're just there's so many vestigial structures we have, and Goosebumps is just one example. So I'll let you look that up if you want for independent work. I actually have a book, and I wish I could assign it for you guys to read, but it's a pretty big book, and it's really interesting. It's about how humans, how like all the flaws in our evolution, like if evolution was purposeful and driven yeah, on purpose, then there's so many things that should be different from humans. Like we've got a lot of things that are really weird about our body and our genes. And again, vitamin C is one of them. But yeah, you can look that up for independent work if you want. Another example that I always like to give is look at whales. Whales eat with their mouth and they breathe with that hole on the top of their head, which might seem weird, but when you think about it, humans and other animals, most animals, it is kind of weird that we kind of eat and breathe out of the same hole. It's dangerous, right? Things choke, people die, other animals die because the food goes down the wrong hole, right? So it's really interesting. But anyway, you can look that up for independent work if you want. There's a lot of good examples. So homology, and again, this is what we're still talking about. We've been talking about different types of homologies. Homology can explain observations about embryonic development as well. So, for example, at some point in development, all vertebrates, so humans, fish, amphibians, everything with a backbone, at some point in our development, we all have a tail and we all have pharyngeal pouches that may, depending on the species, they could become gills if you're a fish. For us, it becomes part of our ears and our throat. And here's an example of that, right? So that's a chicken embryo on the left and a human embryo on the right. And you can see, again, we have a tail. At some point in our development, we had a tail. And of course, these pharyngeal pouches that become different things. So again, that's just one example. You can look up more examples if you want. But yeah, embryo similarities are another type of homology. So any questions about this slide? All right, let's talk about biogeography. The geographic distribution of organisms follows patterns that are best explained by evolution, but also in conjunction with the movement of tectonic plates. And I don't know where that word plate went, but the point is, as you can see here on the left, there was a time, actually more than once, where we had a supercontinent, right? All the continents were together. So the fact that we have similar species in South America as we do in Africa, as we do in Southeast Asia, as we do in Australia might seem weird. Like, well, how would that work then? Because they're so far apart. But the thing is, they didn't used to be so far apart, right? That used to be one big landmass. So that explains how we have those similarities. And it just so happens that this particular landmass that we're looking at here is called Gondwana. And that was 220 million years ago. You don't need to know that for the exam, but that's just a good example. And once again, a good independent work topic, because that's not the only supercontinent there ever has been, right? There's been other ones. So you could look that up, right? Give me the other examples of when we had supercontinents. What were they called? Like, what was the name of it? And how long ago was it? Anyway, any questions about this slide? And also, once again, this flower is just an example. So I'm not going to ask you about the name of this supercontinent or this flower. I just want you to keep in mind, again, that there were times when the land masses were together. So that explains some of the distribution of similar species. All right, let's talk about evolutionary trees. Darwin was the first person to visualize the history of life as a tree with patterns of descent branching off from a common trunk, with the first organism kind of being at the trunk to the tips of millions of twigs representing species living today. So, in other words, Darwin was the first person. Think about like your family tree, right? Going back to this whole idea of 23andMe. When you think about your family tree, that's basically what Darwin did, but instead of with just humans and how humans are related to each other, he was looking at all the species and how they were related. So biologists still to this day illustrate patterns of descent with evolutionary trees, although the tree is usually turned sideways and can be read from left to right. So here's a good example of that from the old textbook. So these are all tetrapods, right? I keep talking about tetrapods. So this is a good example. You have lungfishes who are really, have a common ancestor way back. And this is what this number 1 means, right? So this means the common ancestor between lungfish and hawks, for example, is way back, right? Then you have amphibians, mammals, lizards and snakes, crocodiles, ostriches, so on and so forth. You don't need to memorize this, but if I were to give you this picture and ask you something like, all right, what's more closely related, ostriches and hawks, or let's see, other birds and crocodiles, right? And then the answer would be ostriches and hawks because they have a more common recent ancestor. Other birds and crocodiles, their ancestor is way back here. Hawks and lizards, right? Their ancestor is way back here. So that's the kind of thing you might need to decipher something like this on an exam, but there's definitely nothing to memorize. The next word for attendance, I'm going to kind of use the same pattern. So last time I asked you to give an example of a primate. Now I want you to give an example of a snake. So instead of sending the word snake, send the word of a type of snake. Any questions? All right, let's move forward. Evolutionary trees are basically hypotheses reflecting current understandings of pattern and evolutionary descent. Some of them are based on convincing combination of fossil, anatomical, and molecular data, and others are more speculative. Now, these kind of trees, they're not really speculative. These are big picture things, right? So this is, I don't want to say it's concrete and set in stone, but it kind of is. When I'm talking about things that are more speculative, I'm talking about, like, for example, right here, right, it says other birds. So you could find, and I guess you could for independent work if you want, you could find an evolutionary tree for just birds, right? And think about like all the closely related birds, birds of the same genus, or birds of the same family. That one might be a little bit more speculative, right? So this, again, what we're looking at here is not very speculative. This is kind of a big picture thing. It's kind of set in stone. But the farther you zoom into this and start looking at evolutionary trees more specifically, then it gets a little bit more speculative. Anyway, any questions about that? All right. So this is just an example. Again, I kept it. It's from your old textbook. I'm not going to test you on it, but let's talk about it again. Um, Actually, you know what? No, I'll probably skip this. You can read it if you want. It's about whale evolution. Again, I'm not going to ask you any questions about it, but it really does a good example. It's a good way of showing you some of the stuff I just taught you about evolutionary trees and homologies and uh, things like that. But anyway, take a look at that if you want. Let's see. It's 8:37. Yeah, let's just quit 13 minutes early since it is Veterans Day. And your last word for attendance, I guess just send the name of a veteran. So any veteran that you know, just put their name, first name, last name, whatever it is. Obviously, I have no way of knowing that. You could probably just make up a name, but I'll just trust that you're doing it. So you guys have a good day. I will not be online for office hours today. I plan to celebrate Veterans Day and also hang out with my kids who are not at school. But if you need me, go ahead and email me. I'll try to keep an eye on my emails. And if you really, really need me, call my office, and that is forwarded to my cell phone. So I'm here if you really, really need me. But other than that, I'm going to have fun. Yep. So have a good day, and I will see you on Wednesday.